Welcome everybody. This is very exciting to be here in an in-person event with no restrictions whatsoever. My name is Dalit Kaplan. I'm a storyteller and storytelling trainer, impact investor, a lapsed lawyer like Natasha and probably many in this room. Writer of essays where I've covered topics like grief and the Holocaust and infertility and stillbirth and feminism. I'm currently working on a novel on all of the above, which should definitely be out sometime this century. And for some reason, Melbourne Jewish Book Week organisers thought I'd be a good person to interview Natasha Sholl about her memoir on grief. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and the Bunwurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation as the traditional owners and custodians of this land. This is it's Reconciliation Week, and I believe it was Sorry Day last week as well. I pay my respect to their elders past and present. And really, the First Nations are the first storytellers of this land. And I like to think about how I can pay my rent, and as collectively we can pay our rent. And one of the ways in the literary world that we can do that is by engaging with their literature, the amazing literature that's coming out from First Nations writers now. And I acknowledge that we are standing on the shoulders of those giants of storytellers. We are also standing on the shoulders of the literary Jewish storytellers as well. Our culture has an amazing heritage of storytelling. Really, I think what forms it is stories and narrative, and and I carry that legacy behind me, and draw inspiration from Jewish stories as well. Finally, I would like to acknowledge the sponsor of this event. The festival could not go ahead without sponsors, and our sponsor for this event is an anonymous donor. 12th century philosopher, scholar and doctor Rambam, or Maimonides, wrote that anonymous donations are the highest form of tzedakah, and we thank you, anonymous donor, for your dedication to the arts. And now, Natasha, let me introduce Natasha Sholl. Natasha's memoir, Found Wanting, published by Ultimo Press, tells the story of her attempt to rebuild her life after her partner Rob's sudden death. She was a 22-year-old law student, and he was a 27-year-old doctor. And the memoir covers the subsequent life events, repartnering, marriage, children, and subsequent loss. Natasha completed an arts law degree at the University of Melbourne and has been widely published over the years. Her memoir moves through the landscape of grief, mourning, self-blame, the body, love, intimacy, trust, family, cultural assumptions, and community as she rebuilds her life after such a traumatic loss. In her evocative and often poetic prose, she invites us into her deeply internal process of learning to let go of a future she had dreamed of and assimilating knowledge of life's precariousness into her new future. In her memoir, Natasha contemplates so many questions and mysteries about human psychology and how we make sense of our lives. And I think today is going to be a great conversation. Welcome, Natasha.
Thank you. What a beautiful introduction.
So I invite you already to start thinking about questions you might want to ask, and we'll leave the last 5 to 10 minutes for questions. But first, before we begin formal conversation, I wanted to meditate on the fact that this weekend coming, we'll be celebrating Shavuot, and we'll be reading Megillah Ruth. And I think that the story parallels yours, Natasha, in some way, and it just highlights how universal this story of rebuilding after grief and loss is. Just as a refresher, the story of Ruth is about a husband and wife, Elimelech and Naomi. And Elimelech was said to be a very wealthy man. He lived in Bethlehem, and he had 2 sons. There was a drought in Bethlehem, and they fled the land of Israel to the neighbouring Moab. And both of the sons married local women, one of whom was Ruth. Then tragedy befell the family, and first Elimelech died, and then the 2 sons died. And Ruth decides to stay with Naomi, and that's why the Megillah is named Ruth, or Rut. and they decide to return to their home in Bethlehem. And there's this amazing scene where they return back to Bethlehem. Initially, they were of a wealthy and prominent family, and now Naomi returns a widow and having lost 2 children. And the text describes this moment where there's a lot of excitement and people are talking about this person who's returned. And I'll just read the translation of that description. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole city buzzed with excitement over them. And the women said, "Can this be Naomi?" And that moment really reminded me of a number of moments in your memoir where you describe being talked about and people buzzing around tragedy. And I wanted to ask you firstly, what's your reaction to this description in the text of the Megillah?
I think, firstly, I recognise myself in that text being the one that the buzz was around, but I also recognise myself in being swept up in that buzz. There's part in the memoir where after Rob died, I was someone sort of there was like a widow set up where someone introduced me to someone else who had lost their partner quite young, and I still remember the exact moment where I found out what had happened to her, and I was only, I think, a teenager then, like 17, and I still remember that buzz of talking about this person, and then that sort of reality slap of when I then met her all these years later. But that feeling of that buzz and talking about what had happened to her still, like I could still feel it. So I've been on both sides of that. And I think part of it was this sense of, like, when we hear about something awful happening, there is that buzz and there is that horror of it. And part of it isn't just to gossip, and it isn't, there's no schadenfreude, well, maybe for some, but it isn't just to talk about it. It is almost that sense of othering. Like, here is this thing, and it is so horrific and so tragic that we're getting swept up in talking about it because it's so extreme that it can't possibly happen again, and it can't happen to me, and what's different about this person, and why has it happened to them? And that's part of that buzz, because it's our human need to other ourselves from any tragedy that has happened.
It's interesting that the word is excitement, that there's some energy behind that, and I feel like there's almost this excitement about othering, that we have to quickly other ourselves and make ourselves separate and different from that.
Yeah, it's the shock of it, like, yeah, you can feel it on a visceral level.
Though as we get older, more and more people join that category of people to whom tragedy has happened, and then I think it's interesting also, maybe we rethink how we've heard and digested.
Correct. It's like that innocence lost, that element.
And what does this say about human nature, do you think?
I think it is exactly what we were just discussing in terms of that need to separate ourselves from something and try and identify why it happened. It's always that need of why and the reason behind it, and to look for a reason that happened to someone else and therefore cannot possibly happen to me, and to tell ourselves these stories or to pin some narrative onto it.
I just think it's so interesting that it just parallels the arc that you described, and it's such an ancient text. So I want to talk about, so one thing that I think takes place when others speak of one's story and one's tragedy is that they almost steal the narrative from us, that it becomes their narrative, and we have to find, in our tragedy and bewilderment, we have to find what our story is. We have to reclaim it and own that. Do you think that this book has assisted that? Do you think that was your way of doing that?
I think not necessarily consciously, but in hindsight, yes. I think I've told this story before, but that I bumped into someone shortly after that this was published. I was just out having coffee with my husband Dean, and someone said, congratulations on your book. I've heard it's doing well, but I'm not going to read it because I don't like sad stories. And my reaction to that was, I'm not a sad story. I am a writer. I am many other things. And I think part of that was reclaiming that whole sort of identity of part of me wanted to hang on to that identity of I'm someone who has experienced loss and grief, but I am also, that it's so nuanced, there's so much more to it, and now I'm, it's reclaiming that I'm not just a sad story, I'm other things as well, and your perception of me is not the only version of me. I'm many different things on many different days. And so I think part of that was reclaiming the narrative of what it means to be someone who has experienced loss. And I think shame is a huge element there.
What do you mean?
In terms of, it's almost, not that it was not something that I expected to happen, but it's almost like there's this idea that life should go a certain way, and when it doesn't, it's almost like we're embarrassed. Like, there was this element of shame of this thing that happened, and I couldn't keep the people that I loved alive, and that seemed to follow me wherever I went. And it's not that it came from other people, but I always had this sense of shame of other people's lives follow a certain arc, and then I felt almost embarrassed that these things had happened because I had no context. We're not necessarily taught from an early age of when something goes wrong, actually that's part of life and it's part of the normal course of life, as opposed to it being something that wasn't meant to happen.
That's really interesting. I think I think that speaks to a conversation that we've been having around toxic positivity and expectations. But I think it's also an important conversation in the context of the legacy of the Holocaust. And we're two Jews in Caulfield, and it's been 13 minutes and we haven't raised that yet. So I better put that in there. Chapter 14 is titled "The Holocaust Trumps All," and our grandparents survived the Holocaust, both of our in our cases, came to Australia, rebuilt their lives, and they just got on with it. And this mantra of get on with it, they got on with it, just get on with it, has a very strong legacy for us, for subsequent generations. And it's been a burden, and I think that it hasn't allowed for space for us to feel sad sometimes. I'm interested. I think when you were speaking just now about not being prepared for bad things to happen, that we have an assumption about how the arc is meant to be. Do you think that there's something unique about our generation and our moment in history?
I think in terms of, it's almost like we have this legacy of such monumentally traumatic things happened in our past and in our very recent past, that it's almost like our grandparents, they escaped these situations that we can't even imagine, and then it was almost like, well, they did it for us, and therefore we have a duty to live and to be free and to enjoy our lives. And when we can't do that because of whatever's happened to us, it's almost like that double guilt of, our ancestors survived so much worse than what we're going through. We have a roof over our heads, we have food, we have, children who can be educated in a Jewish school. And so there's that guilt of, well, how can that compare? It can't even touch the sides of what that they went through. So we're not sure, it's almost like we're not sure how to contextualise when things go wrong.
Do you think that there's a quality of, I think, a reaction? One of the reactions, I mean, there are many reactions, but one of the reactions against this, the ultimate suffering, the ultimate trauma, is this expectation that we are living a good life.
Yes.
And this is a good life.
Yes.
And in a way, we weren't prepared for the prospect of bad things going on, the things that we get derailed because of that contrast.
And it's weird that as a culture, like, we're educated from such a young age that bad things can happen, and yet we're still shocked when they do. And it's such a contradiction, isn't it? Such a contradiction. And I guess grief in itself, like everything about grief, is a contradiction, and we have to live in these contradictory spaces. But one of the initial reactions, when Robert died and I was so young, it's people try and at least it. So at least you had time together, or at least he didn't suffer, or at least you can remarry, or at least, and it's this element of there's always a comparison and there's a hierarchy of grief, and you should slot yourself in there and always be thankful and always be grateful. And, you know, it's that whole, you know, especially nowadays, there's that whole hashtag blessed, you know, and that doesn't leave space for the actual feeling and for sitting in that present moment of actually something awful happened and my reaction is normal. And my reaction is exactly how I should be feeling in this present time. And I think as a society, we're not comfortable with that because we do at least it. Like straight away, from the very outset, from the minutes after it happened, it was that element of at least, and therefore however I was feeling was not quite right. And that's why I had that guilt from, you know, the very second that it happened of I'm not doing grief correctly. I'm not getting it right already because how I'm feeling doesn't seem to be sitting comfortably with society's expectation of me.
I'm interested about how that is the Holocaust piece in our own very unique history and context dovetails with the hashtag blessed toxic positivity culture that seems so strong right now, or has been really, I think, since the advent of the social media and the internet. And how are they different? How are they similar? How does the combination become almost more toxic?
Yeah, I think it is more toxic, but the social media thing is interesting because, you know, when Rob died, it wasn't a thing. They didn't have podcasts, they didn't have social media, so people weren't sharing their lives in the same way. And yes, we have this filtered version, but there's also that element of people sharing the realities of what they're going through and the difficult moments and the difficult days. And I was thinking recently, like, I wonder if there had been that outlet, or if people's suffering was more visible on that everyday level, I wonder if I would have struggled as much, because I felt quite isolated and I didn't have that visibility of what people who had suffered grief or anything like that had gone through. So it did seem like a very isolated experience, whereas now there are these communities of people who are out there and showing, you know, what the reality of grief and mourning looks like. So yeah, there's both sides of that.
That's very interesting. I might invite you, because this is relevant, to read that extract on growth and trauma. So that's page 200, the second extract.
The world wants to see post-traumatic growth. It wants to see happy endings, a crescendo of grief and loss and pain and joy that leads to something, somewhere. But what if it doesn't? What if awful things just happen because awful things just happen and we bear them, we endure? How is your mum? People asked, although it was more of a statement. There was only one appropriate response, and it was, she's okay, in the circumstances. This was the answer people wanted, and so I gave it to them. I can't even imagine, they said, although they could. They were imagining it when they asked the question. Her reality was proof that their worst nightmares could happen. Their children may leave to go to work one day and not come home. They said they couldn't imagine, but what they meant was, stop making me imagine. It was much easier to support the cyclists, the athletes, the social movement founders, the charity fundraisers, the strong ones. A family member sent a link to a volunteer-run organisation that helped mothers in need. They were looking for volunteers to help make up packs for newborns from donations, nappies, onesies, breast pumps. For your mum, they texted. It might help. Give her something to do, to give back, as if her inward focus was pure self-obsession and not survival. There was an expectation that she would turn her despair into productivity. The act of grieving wasn't an adequate use of her time. I imagined my mum mourning the loss of her second-born, folding baby booties. There are no medals for the ones who endure, who get through the sleepless nights, who make it through the day, who are stuck in the mess and muck of grief. Grief itself is an endurance sport, endless loops around the track with nothing to show for it.
So it's such a wonderful extract, and I think that merging of productivity with grief is really key. And in a way, I think that the social media machine almost invites us to turn the grief into something that's productive as well. And I'm just interested, and I think we're also very much socialised around that importance around productivity, and that's capitalism. I think that's also a post-Holocaust legacy. We need to be useful. We need to be indispensable. We need to be productive, and it really just doesn't allow for any space for the unproductive, useless moments of having a cry.
Yes. Yeah, and I think there is that element of there were times where I was like, I actually physically don't know what to do with my body in time. I don't know how to function, and yet we're still expected to, be valuable members of society and good partners and girlfriends and sisters and siblings and parents and daughters, and yet I literally can't sleep and can't eat and can't function, and like, where do I put my hands and how do I sit? Like, we have to relearn all these basic life skills because everything's been turned upside down, but we have to act like that's not the case.
What advice do you have to people about shutting that off and allowing yourself just to be with your emotions in that internal process?
I don't know, I'm still learning that. I think, the thing that's difficult for me now, even still, is just sitting in that moment and feeling the emotion of whatever it is at that time, which I think, it's human nature is to run away from that. But that is still such a difficult thing to say. Someone has died and I am sad about it, therefore I will feel sad. And it's such a basic, simple thing, but still such a struggle to say a thing happened, this is a reasonable reaction to it, therefore I will feel that feeling, because feelings can be quite scary and overwhelming.
You describe later in your memoir this moment of insight where you discover that you can feel grief alongside joy. Has that helped, do you think, being able to understand that nuance?
Yeah, that was a massive breakthrough, and it's so obvious when it was spoken. It was like, well, of course, two things can be true at once. And I think even when I started writing this book, I didn't realise that. So I was writing this book, and then that was what was so scary about the writing process, is what am I going to discover at the end of it? And that conversation with that therapist happened after I'd already was like halfway through the book, and it was like, oh my God, like, why did no one tell me this before? Like, this needs to be taught in schools. We need to put up billboards. You can feel two things at the same time. And it just made sense of my life. It gave everything a context of it is a valid feeling that I'm sad that my partner died, and it is a valid feeling that I have a beautiful life and a beautiful husband and beautiful children, and I'm so grateful for that. And those two feelings don't cancel each other out. And no one is asking me to choose between one or the other, because I'm not given that choice, and no one has that choice. And all we can do is exist in this present moment. And it was just a real validation of my life and where I've come from and the people who are in my life now who I love. And I guess, it was just, I felt visible and validated.
It's wonderful. I'll just take us back. I might invite you to read another extract, if that's okay. And that's page 48.
Growing up, we would get weevils in our pantry, maybe once a year. I would hear my mother scream after opening a packet of rice or cereal, tiny crawling specks. And then the laborious steps would begin. Step 1, throw out all the packaged food, sealed and unsealed, rice, flour, pasta, cereal. Weevils can survive in cardboard. Clear the shelves, gut them, every crevice, vacuum, disinfect. I was infected with weevils now, crawling inside of me, larvae waiting to hatch and to contaminate everything, rolling, wriggling, feasting on me from the inside out. I needed to purge, to start again. My feet pounded the treadmill, thump, 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 ignoring the thump, thump, thumping of the feelings threatening to drown me. I could outpace them. I could starve them. I could push them down. Keep running, keep moving, keep focusing. I could be good. See, just look. the paradox of wanting to be seen and unseen, to disappear in plain sight. If I was careful enough, I would just disappear without anyone noticing. I would slowly absent myself from dinner, and then my tiny frame would be so imperceptible that when I did just finally slip away, it would be like I never happened, there and then not. I would be so light that a gust of wind would just carry me away, a whiff of a memory, like dust. Did you hear something? Someone would ask. Nope, someone would reply. And they would look around. I'd be gone, vanished. I would cease to exist, not from here on in, but from the beginning of time.
So it's a really beautiful, beautiful passage, and I think that your writing around eating disorders is so important. It's so important that you've addressed that, and I think it's so interesting that you've spoken about it in the context of grief as well, because often it's treated as something separate. And I'd like to invite you just to talk about what in your mind is the relationship between food, trauma, guilt.
I think shame. And when we don't deal with whatever's happening and we feel that shame, it has to come out somehow, whether it's, drugs, alcohol, eating disorder. There are just so many, self-sabotaging behaviours that people use to deal with that. So I think for me it was that element of shame, like it was literally eating me from the inside out. And there's also that control element. So we have this perception that we have control of the world, and like we know that, in the logical way we can't control everything, but we still don't realise that until it really happens. And so I had suddenly lost control, and I'd found myself, it was almost like someone had picked me up and put me in someone else's life, and it was like, no, I don't belong here. Like, this isn't my life. I don't live here. And so that was my way to get back control and deal with the shame. And yeah.
That's really powerful. How have readers responded to the way that you've covered that aspect in particular?
I think it actually is something that people are still probably not comfortable with. I think people haven't really discussed it as much as other elements of the book. I mean, there's a few things that come up as common themes, but that's something that I think if there's an awareness that something like our relationship to our bodies and eating disorders, it is an ongoing battle, and it's not something that once it's been managed, that then it's over. Like, once that's something that has part of a hold of you, it's something that never really lets go. So I think maybe that is why people are maybe not as comfortable talking about it.
It's interesting. And why did you decide to include that aspect of the story in the narrative?
I didn't decide anything really. It wrote itself, and I made a decision early on to just include everything, and I had to write as if no one would be reading. Otherwise I wouldn't have written anything at all, ever. So I just had to write my truth, and that was a part of my truth. I hadn't planned to write about Judaism. I hadn't planned to write about all these themes that keep coming up with sort of, music or Jewish rituals or other elements that keep coming up, and I had not made any active decisions. All my decision was write the truth of it and write what happened and the way that it happened. And if anything, it wasn't a story about me and what was happening to me. The reason I wanted to write it was, could this be someone else's story about grief? And anything that spoke to that universal story about grief had to be included. And so I think that element of shame and the impact on our bodies and our minds was just such a central part of it that, yeah.
I feel that in terms of, I do believe, even though we write for lots of reasons and those reasons change, writing is a service as well. And I feel that there's a service. You've really invited people to open a conversation that needs to take place. And obviously there is a lot of awareness there is a lot of awareness raising around eating disorders. But it being a part of a bigger story, I think it tends to be siloed over there. And I think it being a part of a bigger story is what's so important.
I was cleaning out my phone yesterday. I get these messages sporadically to tell me I've run out of storage. I don't know if you get them too. And rather than deal with the situation, I just delete random apps and random photos. And so I was doing a clear out literally yesterday, and I came across, I was just like flicking past, and I came across a screenshot I'd taken, and it was September 2019, which was literally when I just started writing this manuscript. And the screenshot I took was of a quote that said, shame dies when stories are told in safe spaces. And I think that element of nothing I had to say had changed from the moment, in the last 15 years, but I felt maybe that the space around me was safer to tell it.
That's during lockdown as well.
Yeah, it was just before, yeah.
The first one?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, that's right. And how did you find that being in that lockdown environment? I mean, there's obviously the logistic nightmare. You've got 4 children, you're homeschooling. But was there a space that was created because of the lockdowns as well, do you think?
So I'd spent 15 years actively not writing this story with a very supportive partner who's nodding his head, who'd been begging me to write since we'd met. And I had avoided it and said, one day I'll do it. And then just before lockdown hit, when I took that screenshot and I'd started putting one day aside a week, I'd go to Stonington Library and I'd write, and I'd made an active decision like this 2020 was going to be my year. And then lockdown hit, and we had 4 very young children at home homeschooling. We were both working and juggling, and I'd never had less time to write. Like there was never a worse time for me to write, but because my time had been taken away from me, that I had to fight for it. And there's something to be said for the human spirit when we have to fight. So I'd had all this time previously to write, and I thought, yeah, one day. And then when I had to really put up a good fight and fight for my time to write and fight for the story to be told, it was like, yeah, there was a fire lit, and it makes no sense, but it became urgent at that very moment.
So interesting. I want to turn to Judaism and the role that Judaism has played in this. The Jewish rituals around death and mourning did provide comfort for you. They did provide space. How did they help?
I think there is something very intuitive about the mourning rituals, and even just from those early days of like show up, talk about the person. It gave, in the same way that I was saying before, I didn't know what to do with my body. I just didn't know what to do or how to exist in the world. It gives a framework for here is where you belong. Here is where you sit. Here is what you talk about. Here is what you physically do. And so I think from that perspective, it is very intuitive.
And what are their limitations, do you think?
I think it excludes people who aren't necessarily, technically within that sort of, the mourning circle. It also, there's a timeline that starts. So from the moment it happens, it's, a Jewish person should be very, very quickly, and 7 days, 30 days, 12 months, but then what next? Like how do you reintegrate into society? Where do you put the grief 5 years, 10 years, 20 years later? Yes, you can start to listen to music, or yes, you can dance at a wedding, but what happens to that feeling when you're feeling just, heavy with grief and having to celebrate something? Like, how do those two emotions sit side by side, when that timeline, the official timeline, has ended?
Yoga pops up a lot in your story. Would you say that yoga or Eastern spirituality or Western glosses on Eastern spirituality took over in the creating the spiritual and ritual space for you to move through the process? I
think I was like a bowerbird, and I would just take whatever was around that I thought could offer me comfort. So, there were aspects of religion, there were aspects of yoga, there were aspects of all these different little things. And, for me, it was what will give me a structure and connection, because I felt like I'd lost that connection. And how do I find a place for myself? So however I could, pick at different things that would offer me answers, that's where I sought comfort.
We have a few more questions, but I'd like to invite the audience also to start thinking about questions that you might like to ask as well. Let's talk a little bit about parenting in the shadow of grief and intergenerational trauma. Something light. So there's ample data now around intergenerational trauma and how children and subsequent generations suffer from or have PTSD symptoms as a result of the way that they may have been raised, even if there was no first-hand experience. And a lot of that data does come from the communities and the Holocaust survivors and their descendants. How do you navigate that challenge of parenting through grief and trauma?
I think it's complex in terms of I don't want to pass on my anxieties and my sadness, but I think if anything, children are so intuitive in the way they manage feelings. Yesterday I was driving and my twins who are 7 now were talking in the back of the car, and they were talking about how they were scared of spiders. And one twin said to the other, I used to be scared of spiders, but there's a daddy long legs upstairs and I called him Pedro, and now that his name is Pedro, we're friends, and his name's Pedro Sholl. He's got our last name, so he's part of our family. And now I look after him. And it was this, and I mean, I'm arachnophobic, so that wouldn't help me, but it was this moment of kids are so aware of when we name things and we can identify them and put a name to them, we can then look after them and nurture them. And so I think parenting has given me this other perspective of I actually don't need to teach them everything. They have this sort of capacity to A, manage that on their own, but B, teach me things, so that, you know, part of this book was putting words to feelings and then identifying them, and then instead of being afraid that the feelings would drown me, that actually I could take care of them and nurture them and the fear would go. And in the same way that Pedro is part of our family, that, you know, the grief and loss, we can name it and we can talk about it and we can identify it and therefore not be afraid of it.
That's wonderful. It's a really wonderful way to tie this up. So I'd like to invite members of the audience who might have some questions. Have we got roving mics? Yes? Oh, it's on its way. So we've got a question down the second row. Just have a moment.
Thanks, Natasha, for writing an amazing and very powerful book. A couple of questions. One is, you said 2019 is when you started to think about writing. So what was the sort of, what brought you to that decision that 2019 was a safe year to start writing? And sorry, another question was, you mentioned that in the context of, you know, the grief, that you didn't have anything to, there was no classes or no one taught you how to handle grief. What should we do as families and as schools to sort of prepare people for inevitable grief that happens in their life? Like, what are some ideas?
So to answer the first question, I think part of it was, and I'm sort of reverse engineering an answer here because I can't necessarily explain it, but the story felt very urgent all of a sudden. And I think part of it was that, you know, my brother Matt died when he was 39 and I was approaching that age. And I don't necessarily know if that is the reason, but I suddenly felt like, you know, if there were, you know, there are so many things that we want to do with our lives, and if, you know, if I don't learn French and if I don't travel the world, and there are so many things that if I don't do those things, like, that's fine, that's okay with me. But if I didn't write this book, that would be the thing that would haunt me. And I knew I had a book in me and I knew it had to come out. And I think approaching the age my brother was, like, I just suddenly realised how young he was when he died, and it just all of crashed on me at the same time. And it was like this physical need, like it was bubbling. It had been bubbling up for a while, but it was like, it just felt like it had to come out of me. And to answer your second question, I think we're getting better as a society dealing with these sort of things, especially like post-COVID. I mean, there's just so much talk about, you know, death and tragedy and just humanising it. And so we create these safe spaces for people to talk and to also realise that people deal with death differently, so that one person's reaction may be completely different to another person's reaction, and yet they are both completely okay. So it's really about, you know, I often talk about there's this sort of the pity face that people do when they see, you know, they say, oh, I'm sorry. And it's this face that people do. And it's because we don't know what else to do. But rather than just sort of, you know, just go through the motions, to say, okay, well, what does this person actually need from me? And how can I be of service to them? And how will that change over time, and to show up and to keep showing up in different ways.
Thank you. Question about the publisher and the connection with the publisher. Sometimes people say the story that you would like to tell is not necessarily the one that they think they can sell. Did you have any problems in that regard?
Yeah, I maybe don't pitch a book mid-COVID that's about grief. I originally pitched this, and it literally ended up sort of in the slush pile, which just means I had no connection to the publisher, and I just sent it through their, you know, the queries page on their website. And the person who picked it up out of the slush pile was one of the publishers at Ultimo Press, and she'd read it and it resonated with her because she'd experienced loss. So it was a thing of right person, right place, right time that she happened to pick it up. And I guess her picking it up and the fact that it resonated with her, she'd experienced a completely different type of loss, but it made her realise, like, if I was expressing something that she connected with, that, you know, life-changing loss happens to us all. It doesn't necessarily need to be, you know, even the death of a loved one. It could just, you know, be a relationship breakdown, or, you know, a diagnosis, or whatever it may be, that life never goes to plan for everyone. So actually it was a book that should connect with people.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question. Is that right? Yes. Did I see a hand up? Very back.
Thank you. Thank you for saying it's funny. The week when I was actually workshopping this in a writer's class, someone who was reading it was like, I'm so sorry, I keep laughing, I don't mean to laugh. I was like, no, that's a good thing. So the week before it was being released, I completely spiraled and thought, oh my God, what have I done? And just that idea of being exposed and people's response to it, like, I think I was catatonic for a full week beforehand. Like, I just couldn't talk about it. I was like, a bit just so nervous about people's reactions and responses. And then when it came out, people have just been so generous with their feedback, and just, you know, from day one to have, you know, emails or messages from complete strangers to say that I'd captured their experience, or that they'd had a really recent experience of loss. Like, you know, even so, I published in February and someone sent me a message to say they lost their partner just in that January, and that this would give them something to explain themselves to themselves and to other people. And so however exposed I was feeling, or I think all the things I was scared of didn't happen, but also I had that context of, however, it's not actually about me, and it's whatever reaction I have, it's all worthwhile to just have that one person to say that I'd helped them. And so it gave it that context, and I just sort of took myself out of that picture.
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. Thank you very much. Thank you to all the questions. I'm gonna wrap up in a minute, but I just wanted to situate this conversation in the context of where we are in the Jewish calendar again. This is Jewish Book Week, Melbourne Jewish Book Week, and I think that Jewish context is important. We're just about to hit Shavuot, and we've been counting the Omer. 48 days ago, we celebrated Pesach, and Pesach is a story of slavery, and Shavuot is the commemoration, the celebration of the giving of the Torah, and that's a moment of revelation. And I think that's such an amazing and important arc, that arc from slavery to revelation, that we revisit every year. So we arrive at revelation, and then next year we'll be back at slavery again. And I feel that your book follows that trajectory also as a pendulum. I feel you had movements forward towards revelation, and then and then moving backwards, and then in terms of the events that took place as well, there was this liberation from that, and then moving back to unfortunately loss again. And I just want to thank you for providing this really powerful and beautiful and nuanced articulation and presentation of that arc that I think is so universal. We saw it in Ruth thousands of years ago. We see it today in 2022, and I congratulate you.
Thank you.
And thank you for inviting us all to have these conversations that are so important.
Thank
and wish you all the best.
Thank you, and thank you for your beautiful questions.